We are starting with the cleaning water after use. We talked about how the different types of things we do to water before we use it. We talked about chlorination. We talked about aeration, right? We talked about all of the things we do at the sewage treatment plant, right? I think. All right, so basically now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about water after we use it. And this is termed sewage, and it's not just, storm rain runoff goes into this sewage and the drainage as well. So basically this is just any dirty water in cities. Basically the sewage gets divided up into 3 steps. We have the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary. Primary is your physical separation, so this is where like the large parts settle out. Secondary is where we use microorganisms, and then tertiary is our chemical. In the U.S., our treatment plants are required to have at least the primary and the secondary treatment. The only time we really need the tertiary treatment is when we're dealing with industrial waste. So, alright, so basically this is a rough scale of what happens in a sewage treatment. Basically, our water comes in over here, and honestly it kind of goes through a solid grate to start off with, takes out all the big giant materials, then it's allowed to settle out in this step, and then the settle out part comes down here and becomes part of the sludge. Then it sends into the aeration zone, which just kind of stirs it up, tries to mix apart the things that are in there, mix everything together, then it's allowed to settle again the sludge settles to the bottom. Then it goes through sand filtration, which again is trying to filter everything out. And then last but not least, it goes through the disinfection. So, the primary treatment. Basically, the first off, it travels through a bar screen. This separates large floating objects like, a lot of things don't have a separate sanitary and sewer or swarm sewers. And so this could be limbs, rags, trash, anything that can fit down a storm drain basically could be filtered out here. After it does this, it is then travels through a grit chamber. Basically, this is where our heavy particles like gravel and rocks and other heavy things settle out to the bottom. Then it goes through a cone-shaped settling basin, and basically this just allows, again, another way to allow all the solids to settle to the bottom. Then we all know that grease floats on top of water. So then the floating material in the grease is skimmed off at the top, and this removes 30 to 40% of our organic matter, which is the main pollutant of our water. So this is just the first step. Basically, the physical treatment is just taking apart physical differences. The secondary treatment is the biological processes. This is basically we encourage bacterial growth in this step because the bacteria eat the organics that we're trying to get rid of. And so we have several different things. We have 3 different ones. Trickling filters. Basically what happens is the sludge goes down through rocks, and basically the bacteria are on the rocks, and then it gives the bacteria more surface area to work on the decomposition. Another one is activated sludge. Basically we just pump oxygen into the sludge where the bacteria are. The bacteria need oxygen, so if there's plenty of oxygen they should be able to thrive. Another one is called an oxidation ditch. This is where basically it's a form of accelerated sludge. It's basically a big giant circle basin, and we have like an arm that kind of circles it and constantly adding oxygen and making sure the bacteria doesn't get down to the bottom. It keeps everything all nice and mixed up with plenty of oxygen. During this process, the solids then either settle out or are skimmed away, and from this step sometimes we burn these, and other times we use them as fertilizers. So that's why near wastewater treatment plants you can always go get some pretty good fertilizers. This step removes approximately 90% of our organics. The tertiary treatment, again, is really only necessary when we are dealing with industrial items, because primary and secondary sewage doesn't really have the harmful chemicals in there that need to be neutralized or whatnot. But if we do have some industrial waste, it honestly depends on what type of waste we're dealing with, what types of chemicals we're dealing with, what we need to add to it to neutralize it. Honestly, it's easier for industries to just pre-treat their water before they dispose of it, as opposed to us trying to figure out what in the world's in the water to treat it after the fact. So a lot of times there's lots of regulations on what they can release into the water. Um, so that was basically talking about water pollution. Now we're going to move on to land pollution. A lot of our land pollution comes from our trash. Our domestic trash, U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but it produces 30% of the world's waste. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, we kind of get a breakdown of where all of our waste come from. The majority of it comes from paper and cardboard. And then it drops down to food waste, yard waste, plastics, metals, so on and so forth. However, 34% of our waste can be recycled. So it looks like 62% of our paper and cardboard is actually recycled every year. So that contributes. So that means about 38% of it is not recycled and just goes into the landfill. 12% of our trash is burned. 54% of it is discarded into landfills. And landfills is what produces a lot of our land pollution. A few other methods of disposal is the first one is burial at sea. This is basically dumping trash at sea. We actually did this a lot before 1980 just because it was easy, it was cheap, we didn't have to maintain it, it didn't stink, it didn't cause a lot of issues. It's illegal now because it would contaminate the ecosystems and it would cause a lot of harm to animal life. The next type is incineration, which is burning your trash, which is still practiced a lot. It does get rid of the trash, but a lot of times, depending on what you're burning, it can increase our air pollution. And therefore, a lot of times it requires scrubbers, which is a way to make our air pollution that we're releasing a little bit safer. So it adds a step, which of course adds more money. But if we do this in the right way, we can actually take 12% of it is mixed with coal, and we burn coal to make electricity. So it actually prolongs the coal burning process, so then we technically use less coal. So it's kind of a fine line. Coal's already a pretty polluting process, so if we add a little bit of trash, it shouldn't make it any worse. Another kind is called an open dump, and this is basically where trash is just dumped on land. Okay, this was actually banned in 1983 because it promotes rats and vermin populations. It allowed trash to get into the groundwater. It was all the landfill negatives. There was basically no positives. So we actually moved on to something called a sanitary landfill, and it's a version of an open dump, except what they do is they dig out a large hole, like a really, really, really big hole in the ground. And sometimes they even put a liner on it, depending on what the bedrock's been. Around here, we don't have to put a liner in it because our bedrock is so hard that it prevents water pollution because it's hard to the water to permeate. A lot of, like in Springfield, their landfill's on top of slate, and so water can't go through the slate. But some places they have to put a liner in there. Basically, what happens is trash is put in the hole, and at the end of every single day, they bury it with dirt. And so this keeps it from being bleached by the sun. It keeps it from being decomposed. It keeps animals away from it. It keeps everything kind of. Now, is it that's really a good thing? No, because it actually produces really, really big mounds, but we just kind of have to figure out the best trash, which there's really no good way for it. This actually produces methane through all the decomposition, which is really flammable, so they have to be really careful about the mounds and make sure that they cover it every day and make sure that there's no place for the gas to collect. And then last but not least, a lot of recycling is done, and this is approximately a third of our waste. Industrial chemical waste, they need to be disposed of with a liner, and this prevents groundwater contamination. Sometimes they also can incinerate it or neutralize it. Some are burned at sea because it produced such toxic fumes that if the population was near it, it would cause some effects in that way. So sometimes they barge it out to the middle of the ocean and then they burn it and then they bring it back. So a few examples of industrial chemical waste is the first one was Hooker Chemical. This was in 1968. What they did is they actually buried waste drums, and I think this was in Pennsylvania, maybe New York, that part of the country. At that point in time, it wasn't really frowned upon. They put their waste in steel drums, and they buried the steel drums in an old canal. And then years later, they didn't really need the land anymore, so they sold the land to the city so that it could for $1 to build a new school on. So then they built the new school on top of all of this waste. And then around schools, usually houses start to develop. And so it became kind of like a suburb. Well, what happened is the drums that was holding the waste became, after getting acid rain on them, started to dissolve, and the waste started to become apparent, and then that caused to groundwater contamination and other sorts of toxicity in and around the soil and the water. And so the whole town basically got evacuated, and all of the government had to buy out the homes from the people, and the company was fined millions of dollars to go in and back and clean up everything. But it's not like they did it on purpose. It was actually an accident. Another example is Hoffman Taft. This was in the 1960s, and this plant was actually in Verona, down the road a little bit. Basically, they created a lot of waste. That plant was known for the production of Agent Orange back in Vietnam times for the military. And basically, all the waste that they produced from that, they just put in these giant waste drums because they weren't really sure what to do with it. Well, as time went on, this company was bought by another company and then bought again by another company. And nobody was really sure what was in the waste containers because they didn't really label it. They just kind of left it there. And so they tried to get rid of it, and they sold it to another company. They came to dispose of it, and this company mixed it with other waste oil, and they used it to spray down like dirt roads to keep all the dust from settling, to kind of keep everything down to the ground. And they actually used it a lot in a town in Missouri called Times Beach up there close to St. Louis. And basically, they didn't know this at the time, but it contained a lot of dioxin, which is very, very, very toxic to humans and animals. And I mean, it was a waste product from Agent Orange, and Agent Orange basically destroyed everything it came into contact with. And so basically, Times Beach was kind of a vacation little city outside of St. Louis, and they started noticing a lot of people getting sick and a higher rate of cancer, and it took them a long time to figure out what it was, but basically this had been sprayed all over the ground, and so now it's a ghost town, and the government bought it from it because it still contains, it had like 500 parts per million of dioxin when the okay level was 1. And so it was very, very, very toxic. So the government came in and they basically incinerated all of the topsoil, everything they could come into contact with, and now it's just a big state park. The Route 66 State Park is a ghost town because of dioxin poisoning. This is actually one of the worst chemical waste cleanup projects to date. This leads us to something called the Superfund. All of this cleanup that we keep talking about, well, somebody has to pay for it, right? This was paid. The Superfund is kind of like a general fund that the government has that is paid for by a tax on chemical and petroleum industries. So basically, they are taxed into this fund. And then whenever there is a waste issue or a cleanup issue, they pull the money out of this fund. This is used to clean up orphaned waste sites. Usually the wastes were unknown, what they contain or who made them or what in the world they are. So we use this fund to try to figure out what it is and dispose of it properly. If a source is found, so if we figure out who produced the waste or who released the waste, then the government will make them pay for the cleanup. Another type of waste is something called strip mining, and this is a cheap way to extract minerals like coal from land. This is much safer than underground mining because you don't have to worry about the cave-ins. However, basically what they do is they just take away all the topsoil and they put it to the side. Well, that loosens up everything, which increases erosion, makes it erode 1,000 times faster, and now all of this stuff is exposed to runoff, which when you're mining for things, it can create acid mine drainage, and so then it makes our lakes and rivers a little bit more acidic, which can affect all of those things we talked about the other day with fish kills and algae blooms and all of those things. In 1978, they actually enacted a law that said land must be restored after strip mining. We have to do something, plant vegetation on it, put everything back where you found it, something like that. So homework for chapter 13 is on page 245. There's lots of homework for this chapter. And these are just kind of some pictures from that Times Beach that I was just telling you about. This is basically the road into Times Beach when this first happened. Said, this is a waste site for dioxin contamination. Stay in your car, minimize your travel, keep windows closed, stay on the pavement, and drive slowly. So basically, you were trying to not stir up all of the stuff and get it into your car because you didn't want to breathe it in. Now it's a state park. So yay. And then this is the Agent Orange that we dropped on Vietnam in the Vietnam War. That's what it was, literally orange. Basically, the planes would just fly over and drop it down on all the vegetation because it would kill everything it came into contact with. And then the Viet Cong couldn't hide. It allowed us to see where they were. So there's chapter 13. Nope, we gotta do chapter 14 now.